Imagine an army that, in just 1 century, conquered almost half of the known world. In the 13th century, the Mongol hordes inspired terror were considered an unstoppable force, and in the accounts of contemporaries and later chroniclers, their numbers often reached fantastic proportions. But how many Mongol warriors were there really who marched from the steppes of Central Asia to the borders of Europe and the Middle East? In this video, we will try to figure out the real size of the Mongol armies by evaluating historical data and answer the question of whether the Mongol army was really as huge as it was imagined. Let me remind you, you are on the Amazing History channel for those who truly love history, and we continue our series of episodes dedicated to the Mongols.
You can support my humble work, as always, with a like, a subscription, and kind comments, as well as with a donation on Patreon or PayPal. Now, let's get started with the topic of this episode.
At the beginning of their history, Mongol armies were mainly made up of men from their own tribe, and the most skilled warriors were selected for the keshik, the personal guard serving powerful chiefs and commanders. At the beginning of Temujin's rule, the number of these elite warriors was only a few hundred, but with the founding of the Mongol Empire, Temujin fundamentally changed the structure and nature of military operations. The steppes. The main change was absorbing nearby steppe tribes during long unification wars. This process was completed at the Kurultai in 1206, where Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the United Tribes. Under his rule were the Merkits, Kiraits, Naimans, Tatars, Uyghurs, Oirats, Buryats, and others. These once warring tribes were now recognized as a single people under the common name Mongols. By uniting various steppe peoples, Genghis Khan gained a significant mobilization resource, which was effective thanks to military reforms. Every able-bodied man between the ages of 15 and 60 was required to serve. Conscripts were required to bring at least one horse and a set of equipment with them. If a warrior lacked equipment, his immediate commander provided him with everything necessary. The armament of Mongol warriors could vary, but historical sources, including Chinese texts and Persian chronicles, allow us to reconstruct their typical weaponry. Ideally, each steppe warrior had at least one suit of armor, 2 or more composite bows, and several hundred arrows. The arsenal could also include a long and a short spear, a mace or an axe, a knife, and a flint. The warrior also brought his personal banner. A key part of the equipment was horses. Each rider had to have at least 3 horses, and on average, according to estimates, their number could reach 6. This allowed the Mongols to change horses on the march, maintain a high speed of movement, and use them as a source of food when necessary. Discussion of Mongol troop organization should also include non-nomadic or garrison troops. As a rule, they were not part of the main steppe army and were mainly used for garrison duty or to support siege operations. Such auxiliary units could be assembled from conquered peoples and were called cheriki. The first such garrison troops included Jin soldiers who had deserted or been captured during the Mongol campaigns in northern China. These groups, having retained their officers and battle formations, came to be called Hei Chun. Their task was to hold and defend the conquered territories. Later, during administrative reforms, significant units of the Black Army were reorganized according to the Mongol military structure, which gave rise to the Shinchun, or the New Army. All units of the Mongol army received their structure and purpose from the Mongol administration, which convened at the Kurultai. The Kurultai was an assembly of tribes, chiefs, and military leaders, where khans were elected, commanders were appointed, and key strategic decisions about campaigns were made. These grand events were also accompanied by feasts, dances, and games, as was typical for gatherings of thousands of people. After the Kurultai, the army would set out for war. The army was organized according to the decimal system, where the smallest combat unit was the Arban, a squad of 10 men led by an Arban Nayon. The units generally consisted of mounted archers, who were sometimes supplemented by heavily armed cavalry used in close combat. The exact ratio varied, but according to historical data, it is believed that for every close combat warrior there were several light archers. Therefore, to simplify our calculation, let's assume that an arban consists of 6 archers and 4 heavy cavalrymen. Here, it's worth clarifying that I'm using the term heavily armed cavalrymen purely as a convention. These warriors were much lighter and much more mobile than European knights. It would be more accurate to use the term medium-armed cavalryman here. They could be equipped with long spears and shields, and their protection consisted of a metal helmet and armor made of metal plates, connected by leather straps. Each warrior usually had about 6 riding horses with him on average, which amounted to a total of 60 horses per arban, most of which were mares. It can be assumed that in addition to war horses, the troops were accompanied by flocks of sheep and pack animals, including camels, which played an important role in providing food and transporting equipment. The warriors could also have dogs, such as banhars, known for their ability to herd animals and guard the camp. Warriors from the same arban could live in one yurt, called a gera. It could be disassembled and transported on a cart attached to one of the draft animals. Such a large number of animals accompanying the Mongol army played a major role in providing them with food in the field. The diet of the Mongol army was largely based on dairy products. Horses produced milk, from which the warriors made kumis, a refreshing and nutritious fermented milk drink. Another common product was kurut, dried cottage cheese, which was easy to transport and could be diluted with water. The Mongols also fed on the blood of their horses in extreme cases and prepared dried meat for campaigns such as the Khwarezm campaign. An arban was allotted about 3 to 4 carcasses of dried sheep, which were boiled in a cauldron as shulen, a traditional Mongolian meat broth. But let's continue talking about the structure of the Mongol army. The next unit after the arban was the jegun, which consisted of 10 arbans, meaning it included 100 warriors, approximately 60 mounted archers, and 40 medium-armed cavalrymen for close combat. This unit was commanded by the jagun noyon. Based on our previous assumptions, a jagun was accompanied by about 600 horses, around 30 sheep or other animals for food, about a dozen camels, several Benkar dogs for protection, and about 5 to 7 carts with belongings. In the camp, about 10 yurts housed such a unit. To feed all these animals, a plentiful supply of grass and water was necessary, which was vital for the successful movement of the army. Since the Mongol troops depended heavily on pastures, their movements were often limited by geography. If pastures in an area ran out or conditions became unsuitable, the army had to either move on or return to the steppe. In the combat system, the jagun could also be used as the vanguard of a group of scouts called alginchi, or those who go ahead, alginchi. They operated at a considerable distance, usually from 30 to 75 kilometers ahead of the main column, acting as scouts and raiders. They looked out for supply sources, suppressed resistance along their way, and gathered information for the army. In peacetime, alginchi performed functions signaling the army in case it was necessary to mobilize forces against a possible rebellion. The next level in the decimal system was a group of 10 jaguds known as miengan, which included 1,000 warriors. Accordingly, about 600 of them were light horse archers and 400 were medium or heavy cavalry. This unit was commanded by Miangan Noyon. Based on previous assumptions, each Miangan had a herd of about 6,000 riding horses, around 300 sheep, about 100 horses, some camels, several herding dogs, and up to 100 wagons carrying equipment and food supplies. For setting up camp, up to 100 yurts were needed, plus an additional yurt for the commander and his entourage. The Miangan was the smallest, most autonomous operational unit, capable of independent combat. And in peacetime, it was used to manage nomadic settlements, which consisted not only of warriors, but also of their families. Based on the previously formed Miangan units, which were composed of horsemen. They formed the foundation of the empire's military organization, allowing the empire to conduct successful conquests on land. Their armies maintained advanced reconnaissance units called Aljinshi and established supply bases for the forward forces. Such a mobile structure of the Miangan units significantly increased the speed and effectiveness of the Mongol army, which earned them a reputation as one of the most maneuverable forces in military history. Then, 10 Miangan units were combined into one Tumen, numbering 10,000 men, of which approximately 6,000 were horse archers and 4,000 were medium or heavy cavalry. The Tumen was accompanied by a herd of about 60,000 horses, 3,000 sheep, up to 1,000 camels and dogs, as well as around 1,000 wagons for transporting equipment and provisions. Since the Tumen was intended for major military operations, it could be accompanied by up to 500 engineers and craftsmen. Specialists trained for building fortifications and camps were often recruited from conquered peoples, such as the Jin dynasty or the Shisha kingdom. It should be noted that each of the terms used to designate Mongolian units also referred to administrative and territorial divisions. For example, an Arban was associated with 10 households, a Jagan with 100, a Miangan with 1,000, and the population of one Tumen was required to provide 10,000 warriors. The commander of a Tumen was considered a representative of a large nomadic community, so this position was extremely prestigious. The first commanders of Tumens under Genghis Khan were his closest associates, such as Subadeh, Jebe, Kubilai, and Jelme. These renowned generals often led their Tumens at the forefront of Mongol conquest campaigns, effectively acting as independent operational groups, paving the way for the main army. Their autonomy and ability to operate without direct support from the main forces are impressive and demonstrate the scale of capabilities of such 10,000-strong units. Although the combat strength of a Tumen on paper may seem relatively small, it was accompanied by up to 60,000 horses and thousands of additional animals and support personnel, who were rarely taken into account when assessing the size of the army. All this significantly increased the resource needs of a Tumen. To support such a unit, extensive pastures and water resources were required, estimated at between 280 and 850 square kilometers of land. These figures clearly show why. Mongolian Tumens, like locusts, consumed vast supplies along their path, and their leaders had to carefully plan their movements to avoid depleting resources in too limited an area. But the true scale of the Mongol army becomes especially apparent when several Tumens unite into a single force. For example, 3 Tumens make up about 30,000 warriors, of which around 18,000 are horse archers and 12,000 are medium and heavily armed cavalry. Such a formation was commanded by a Noyon appointed by the Khan, who possessed significant authority and the ability to distribute command positions among subordinate vassals. To support such an army, up to 180,000 horses were used, about 9,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and roughly 3,000 wagons, as well as a large number of yurts. In addition to the army, auxiliary personnel joined, including engineers. If we talk about the total number of the entire Mongol army during the reign of Genghis Khan, it varies. Historical sources mention figures of 500,000 to 600,000 warriors, but it is difficult to name an exact number due to a lack of reliable statistics and conflicting data. Assuming all Mongol men served in the military, that's roughly 15–20% of the nomadic population, which estimates put between 700,000 and 1 million. Then the most reasonable estimates lead us to a number of 100,000 to 130,000 warriors. Most likely, the Mongol army usually did not remain united, but was divided into separate parts, in order to facilitate logistical support and to maneuver more easily around the enemy. As they advanced, the Mongols would set up a night camp, To prevent sudden attacks, the troops were positioned around the command tent, creating an inner circle of defense. The yurt of the commander, located in the center according to sources, was set about 400 to 600 meters away from the other yurts. Only the guards and approved personnel were allowed to enter it. Around this central yurt, the other units of the Tumen were positioned, probably according to their decimal structure. According to our estimates, the area of the Tumen's circular camp was about 2 square kilometers. A camp with a diameter of about 1.6 kilometers could be crossed on foot in 20 minutes or at a gallop in 2.5 minutes. It should also be noted that the actual area of the camp increased significantly due to the pastures needed for the huge herds that grazed in the surrounding area. When it was time to move on, the order was given by drum beats. The first beat meant to prepare the horses, the second to dismantle the yurts and form up, and the third to begin moving. The main formation consisted of a central column which included the main body of the army, the headquarters of the Tumen commanders, as well as supply wagons. The flanks were protected by special detachments that moved parallel to the central column. They could also deploy to the sides to protect the army from possible ambushes. In front of the main column were the vanguards, and behind it was the rear guard, while additional scout and patrol detachments moved even further ahead. The strictness of the Mongol army's movement scheme depended mainly on the commander's decisions, the terrain, landscape, and enemy threat level. The main army with all its elements moved relatively slowly because the animals needed time to graze and the supply units had to maintain the overall pace. The army averaged no more than 25 kilometers per day, about the pace of infantry. However, the speed and mobility of the Mongols were the result of their use of flying columns, small detachments of light cavalry that moved quickly without a supply train. Such columns could advance distances exceeding 100 kilometers per day, leaving the main army far behind and creating the impression of lightning-fast movement. These flying detachments were used for sudden raids, reconnaissance, and establishing forward positions, which allowed the Mongol army to be renowned for its swiftness and ability to quickly reach enemy lines. Next, let's examine how the Mongol forces acted in battle. One of the most famous tactics was the formation in the shape of a crescent or pincers. The most experienced warriors were placed in the center of the formation to ensure the strength of the line, while on the flanks there were mobile units of light cavalry intended to outflank and encircle the enemy. The main goal was often to encircle and divide the enemy forces, similar to the steppe hunting tactic where riders would drive their prey by closing the circle. This was achieved by gradually exhausting the enemy through wave attacks. The Mongols often formed up in 5 lines, with the first 3 consisting of mounted archers and the rear 2 made up of medium and heavy cavalry. The battle began with the first line of mounted archers advancing and firing arrows from a range of about 300 meters. Using the long range of the Mongolian composite bow, the real power of the shot was unleashed when the arrows were fired from a distance of 50 to 70 meters from the enemy. And then the archers would turn around and return to the main line. Soon, the next wave would move forward, creating an almost continuous stream of fire after the third wave of mounted archers. The enemy was often in a state of shock, and this opened the way for a strike by the heavy cavalry, which crashed into the enemy while they were still disorganized. If the enemy maintained their formation, the Mongols could switch to a feigned retreat, a maneuver they had perfected. They would sometimes retreat for several days. The arrows were used to lure the enemy out and destroy them at the right moment. If the enemy didn't fall for this, the Mongols would use another psychological tactic, encirclement, leaving a small gap for retreat. The escape route often prompted the enemy to flee, and as soon as a mass retreat began, the Mongols would strike the enemy, using the chaos to easily destroy them. Such tactics restrained, exhausted, and demoralized the opponents, reducing their chances of successful resistance to a minimum. The Mongols created one of the most effective armies in history. Based on strict decimal organization and unique mobility, they combined fast cavalry with the destructive power of the composite bow. Their military campaigns required detailed logistics, skillful resource management, and discipline, which ensured the army's autonomy and independence. As a result, the Mongol army not only conquered the armies of a vast territory, but also set a new standard in the art of warfare. The nomadic way of life became the perfect school for acquiring logistical skills, which later gave the Mongol army unique advantages. During campaigns, from childhood, Mongols learned to manage herds: sheep, goats, oxen, camels, and of course horses. These herds not only provided food, but were the foundation of their lives. They gave milk, meat, wool, leather, bones for tools, and much more. Seasonal migrations required nomads to plan carefully. They had to consider weather conditions, the state of the pastures, and their ability to recover in order to avoid depleting resources. Winter pastures were preserved so livestock could graze by digging food from under the snow. Mongolian horses played a leading role in this. They were short, hardy, and unpretentious animals, able to feed themselves even in harsh conditions by digging through the snow. Sheep and goats, for example, would follow in their hoofprints, finding food after the horses. The horse was of great importance to the Mongol. It served as transportation, a battle companion, a source of milk, and, in extreme cases, food. It was thanks to these animals that the Mongols were able to move quickly over vast distances, remain minimally dependent on external supplies, and adapt to different conditions. Their knowledge of nature, ability to maintain a balance between the number of animals and available resources, and constant readiness to move made the Mongols masters of logistics. During military campaigns, their armies resembled giant nomadic communities, where every warrior was at the same time a herdsman, a craftsman, and a fighter. Such self-sufficiency turned them into one of the most mobile and effective armies in history. As nomads, the Mongols skillfully used steppe resources, making their army highly autonomous and flexible. Their livestock, including horses, sheep, and goats, fed exclusively on grass, which freed the Mongol army from the need for complex and expensive supplies of grain or hay, as was required for the larger horses of sedentary societies. Each warrior usually had several horses, typically from 3 to 6, which he rotated to avoid overburdening a single animal. This allowed the warriors to move their equipment without delay while remaining ready for battle. That was the point. Less mobile types of livestock, such as sheep and goats, stayed in the rear, where they were used as a source of food and materials. These herds were part of the base camp, known as the Orda, which served as the supply center for the Orda army. It moved slowly, accompanied by wagons, oxen, and the families of nomads, and was often led by the wives of khans or military leaders who managed the camp. In the absence of the commanders-in-chief, the main forces operated far ahead of the Orda, conducting reconnaissance and swift attacks. Such a structure provided the army with incredible mobility, allowing them to conduct long-distance campaigns without having to rely on outside support. Such autonomy made the Mongol army practically invincible on the open expanses of Eurasia. The Mongols skillfully organized the army's supply during campaigns, relying on simple but nutritious food and the rational use of resources. Each group of 10 men, the Arban, would stock up in advance on dried meat, dairy products, and other long-lasting foods. Among these were dried strips of meat, hard milk curd, and special types of cheese. These foods were easy to transport, did not spoil on the road, and provided the necessary energy for long campaigns. The Western horses that the Mongols took with them served not only as mounts to be switched out, but also as a source of food. Maris were especially valued, since their milk could be used to make kumis or drunk raw, and in case of necessity, their veins were pierced to obtain nourishing blood. In extreme cases, when a horse died, its meat was processed right on the spot, and simple dishes were prepared from it. Bones were used to make a rich broth known as chulen, which was often thickened with millet, meat, and available vegetables. Nothing went to waste, and in many sources the Mongols' willingness to eat anything is often noted with disgust. In addition, the Mongols were actively engaged in hunting. They hunted big game, birds, or small animals such as marmots. Such raids not only replenished their supplies, but also allowed the warriors to practice archery, improving their combat skills. The logistics of the Mongol army became more complicated as they advanced deeper into foreign territories, where there were fewer pastures and the enemy's resources were limited. To deal with this problem, the Mongols used a predatory supply tactic. Their troops dispersed across rural areas, where they used both natural pastures and grain from local storehouses. Meanwhile, the warriors ate food taken from the locals, including the peasants' harvest. This strategy both supplied the army and crippled the enemy's economy, driving peasants to cities and draining defenders' resources. In addition, chaos increased, and rumors about numerous detachments appearing everywhere exaggerated the real size of their army. This created a myth about their incredible speed of movement, but in reality their speed depended on the terrain and the route. For example, Bati and Subidi during the Western campaign in the 1230 says covered about 2. At the same time, the Mongols were attractive, but also for everyone. However, such conditions were rare. For example, Hulagu's campaign in Iran in the 1250s was much slower. In one section, it covered about 15 kilometers per day, and in hard-to-reach regions, the speed dropped to 6 to 9 kilometers per day. Hulagu often made long stops to allow the horses to graze, rest, and regain their strength. His army, which included up to 150,000 men, was more diverse in composition than Genghis Khan's original army, and a significant part of it consisted of allied troops, which also slowed down the advance. Since we mentioned the allied troops, it should be added that they included steppe Turkic tribes, Khadans, Yurchens, Tanguts, and northern Chinese. Engineers and craftsmen were vital, building bridges, roads, and siege machines. The army's diversity made surviving solely on mare's milk and blood impossible. To support such large-scale campaigns, the centralized logistics of the Mongol Empire were used, for example, the yam system. The great Khan Munk ordered in advance to establish supply depots along the route of his brother Hulagu's army. These depots stored huge reserves of flour, wine, and other products collected from across the entire territory of the empire. The horses were provided with pastures that had been cleared and left fallow in advance. In addition, roads along the army's route were improved, bridges were repaired, and ferries were prepared. Vassals and governors in the areas where the troops passed received debts. The task was to organize additional supplies so that the army could advance without stopping. Hulagu carefully chose the timing for campaigns to avoid the summer heat and to make the most of the availability of pastures for livestock. This well-thought-out organization allowed the Mongol army to maintain mobility and high combat effectiveness even in remote territories, showing how effectively they combined nomadic traditions with centralized management. By the time of the great campaigns, the Mongols could no longer rely solely on the resources provided by the steppe and needed centralized supply. Unlike the early raids, large-scale campaigns such as Hulagu's campaigns were carried out without the accompaniment of families. Even Hulagu himself could not take his wives with him. And most of them arrived in the Ilkhanate only in the late 1260 as years after his death in 1260. This highlights how difficult and lengthy such campaigns were for the garrisons stationed on the distant frontiers of the empire. Separating families was official policy. Without the opportunity to return home, the soldiers often took local wives, which led to their assimilation with local cultures. This contributed to the rapid mixing of Mongol garrisons with Turkic and Persian peoples in the western part of the empire. As a result, the Mongol presence in these regions became less apparent, and their cultural influence gradually weakened. These social and logistical changes were also reflected in the weaponry of the Mongol warriors. It adapted to new conditions and incorporated elements of local traditions, making the empire's armies even more versatile. Every Mongol, in addition to their skills in warfare, was required to be able to make and maintain their own equipment, including bows, arrows, and saddles. However, the production of metal items such as arrowheads, swords, and armor required centralized and complex organization. At the beginning of the conquests, Mongolia did not have enough resources for mass production of metal weapons, and they were heavily dependent on imports from neighboring states. China, Central Asia, and Persia provided a huge amount of iron and steel, which allowed the Mongol army to be supplied with the necessary materials. For example, in China, there were well-developed metallurgical centers that supplied the Mongols with weapons and ammunition. But only wealthy warriors could afford swords and metal armor. Therefore, the metal available at the beginning of the campaigns was more often used to make simple, but not very effective types of weapons, such as spears and maces. As the empire grew, the Mongols started integrating craftsmen from conquered peoples. After each battle, the enemy's equipment was collected and redistributed within the army. This applied to both weapons and armor. For example, during the campaigns in Khwarezm and other regions, the Mongols captured and relocated blacksmiths and craftsmen so they could work for the army. Such specialists settled in production centers like the city of Chinkay-Balgasun, founded by the influential official Chinkay in western Mongolia. This city served not only as an arms factory, but also supplied the army with food and other necessary provisions. Special attention was given to the production of arrows. The Mongol army needed millions of arrowheads, and workshops like those in Karakorum played a key role in maintaining the army's combat readiness. Production required great effort. One blacksmith could make from 200 to 300 arrowheads a day working with a fairly simple forging technique. In large workshops, this number increased due to the use of captured craftsmen and division of labor. These items were cheap to produce and easy to transport, which made them the ideal weapon for Mongolian tactics. Besides arrowheads, metal was used to make protective plates for horses and riders. Even simple metal elements such as rings for chainmail or rims for shields played an important role. In some cases, simpler materials like leather were reinforced with metal plates, creating effective and lightweight armor. Mongolian craftsmen also adapted captured weapons and techniques to their needs. For example, they could rework weapons, swords, and spears into lighter and more compact forms, convenient for use in fast cavalry attacks. Arrowheads were designed in such a way as to easily pierce armor and also inflict serious wounds on the enemy or their horses. To supply the army during long campaigns, the Mongols organized mobile blacksmith workshops. These workshops accompanied the troops and used portable forges to repair or make arrows and other metal components right in the field. Despite this centralized system, mass production of swords and armor for all warriors was never a priority. Only the elite, especially the Khan's bodyguards, were provided with high-quality metal weapons and armor. Most warriors used captured equipment or made do with basic tools, including knives, bows, and simple leather protection. European travelers, such as Guillaume de Laurent-Rubruck, noted that only a small part of the army was fully equipped with metal armor. This is evidence that the Mongol army remained extremely mobile, and its successes were based not on heavily armed units, but on strategic flexibility and mastery of archery. An important tool for the Khans was communication between their troops. For this, they developed one of the most famous postal systems in history, the Yam. The Yam stations, located on average about 30-25 miles apart, were like relay points stretching across the entire Mongol Empire. The communities where the Yam stations were located provided food for the animals and lodging for the couriers. The couriers, carrying written or oral messages, would ride furiously to each station. There, they would replenish their supplies, rest, switch to fresh horses, and set out on their way. To deliver messages as quickly as possible, each user of the system was given a credential tag, which was called GRG in Mongolian and Paisa in Chinese. It gave its bearer the right to have their orders followed unconditionally across the empire. The highest form of such a passport was a golden paisa with a tiger's head, on which the name of Genghis Khan was engraved. The paisa also specified which goods or services should be provided to the bearer. Genghis Khan likely learned about postal stations from defectors of the Jin Empire. On the other hand, it could have arisen on its own as a response to the need to maintain order and governance in a rapidly growing empire regardless of its origin. Genghis Khan recognized the need for such a system by the year 1210. During the 13th century, especially under Ugade and Munke, the yam was significantly expanded. However, the system was sometimes disrupted and became a source of irritation for local residents who were forced to maintain the stations, as well as for officials and merchants who abused its privileges. In many territories of the empire, the yam did not become widespread even during the height of the Great Khan's power. Nevertheless, it remained an important means of communication between the distant parts of the empire, helping to coordinate the actions of the army and administration. Through the yam system, it was possible to transmit orders, create schedules, and organize state events, such as the censuses carried out by order of Munke. This system enabled the mobilization of troops and supplies for major campaigns. Thanks to the yam stations, Kulagud was able to meet a large number of allied contingents and replenish food supplies without significant delays. When he reached the fortress of the assassins Maimundis, the yam system played a key role. The troops sent from the Ulus of Jochi crossed the Caucasus and joined Kulagud's army in northern Iran, so the combined forces were able to crush the fortified bastions of the assassins. The use of efficient postal systems, well-planned supply for the troops, mobile forges, and centralized resource management allowed the Mongols to support huge armies over long distances and in constant combat conditions. This combination of nomadic traditions with centralized organization played a crucial role in the Mongols' victories, allowing them not only to conquer new territories, but also to maintain the stability of their troops. And the troops from the north joined in northern Iran. The Mongols became known as unstoppable conquerors, destroying everything in their way. But the Mongol army was not a homogeneous horde of nomads at all. On the contrary, a significant part of their troops consisted of representatives of many different peoples. Without these people, Genghis Khan's empire would hardly have been able to reach such a scale. Even during the times of the struggle to unite the Mongol tribes, Temujin relied on troops of very different origins, although they were all Getirs. Katerina's nomads were skilled with the bow and horseback riding, but not all of them spoke Mongolic languages. Numerous Turkic tribes fought in his army, among whom there were even Eastern Christian Nestorians, who were influential in many steppe communities. For nomads, ethnic boundaries did not matter much. Tribal names often indicated not so much language or origin, but rather clan affiliation and political alliances, which could easily change depending on circumstances. That is why the Turkic tribes who submitted to Temujin, especially after he took the title of Genghis Khan, quickly became part of the Mongolian identity. They adopted Mongolian hairstyles, clothing, and even traditions. This happened in earlier eras as well, for example, with the Huns or in the Turkic Khaganate, where various nomadic peoples merged into a single political entity. After establishing the Mongol Empire in 1206, Genghis Khan quickly expanded his territories, adding new peoples to his army. Many of them spoke Turkic languages and had different ways of life. Among them were nomads, semi-nomads, and even settled farmers. The army included forest tribes from the Baikal region, the Yenisei Kyrgyz, the Uyghurs, the Karluks, and many others. Some of these peoples were important in both military and imperial administration. For example, the Uyghurs proved to be essential allies of Genghis Khan. They not only provided him with experienced scribes and officials, but also shared their script, which was adapted for the Mongolian language and is used in Inner Mongolia. To this day, thanks to the Uyghur administrators, the Mongols were able to govern the conquered territories more effectively. However, despite the expansion of the army's ethnic composition, its core remained unchanged. Genghis Khan relied on cavalry. In the early steppe campaigns, infantry was considered more of a burden than an advantage for the swift strikes and sudden raids that formed the basis of Mongol tactics. Mobile horsemen were invaluable. But the situation changed when the Mongols encountered the large sedentary states of China in their struggle with the Tangut Kingdom. In Western Xia, the Mongol cavalry demonstrated its superiority in open battles, but proved to be ineffective during the siege of fortified cities. The Mongols had no experience in conducting long sieges, lacked the necessary technology, and, unlike the Chinese and Persian armies, did not have developed engineering units. This became a serious problem, and Genghis Khan had to look for new solutions. The Mongols gradually used the resources and knowledge of conquered peoples, involving specialists and adapting their experience for their own needs. This is how the formation of a new multi-layered army began, which allowed the Mongols to conquer not only the steppes, but also the cities. Genghis Khan achieved his first significant victories over the Jurchen Empire thanks to the mobility of his cavalry and unmatched skill in archery. However, he understood that military superiority alone was not enough for a final conquest. To conquer a vast, densely populated country like Jin, it was necessary to exploit internal divisions by setting population groups against each other. The Jin Empire was a multi-ethnic state with three main peoples who differed in origin, language, and social status. First, the Jurchens, a Tungusic people from Manchuria, ancestors of the future Manchus, formed the ruling elite of the empire, controlling the army, administration, and key resources. Second, the Khitans, a people related to the Mongols, once ruled northern China and Mongolia during the Liu dynasty, but were conquered by the Jurchens. Although many Khitans remained in the Jin army and administration, their status was second-rate, which caused discontent. The northern Chinese, who were the majority, worked in agriculture, crafts, and trade, forming the backbone of the empire's settled life. The Khitans were key to the Mongol conquest of the Jin Empire, even before the invasion started. Many of them began to secretly side with Genghis Khan, providing him with intelligence, guides, and even troops. After conquering their own Liu dynasty, the Jurchens restricted the Khitans' career advancement, humiliating and pushing them out of the privileged layers of society. This created tension among the Khitans, which the Mongols skillfully exploited. In 1211, when Mongol troops invaded Jin lands, the Jurchen rulers tried to prevent a possible Khitan uprising by settling Jurchen colonists in their territories. But this move had the opposite effect. The Khitans rebelled, restored Liu, and quickly pledged allegiance to Genghis Khan as thanks. He granted the Khitans significant autonomy and included them in his army as allies. Thanks to this, the Mongols not only gained additional troops, but also weakened the Jin army, which lost a significant part of its cavalry. The Khitans did not limit themselves to participating in wars against the Jin. Their heavily armed cavalry also proved useful on the western fronts of the Mongol conquests. In 1218-19, when the troops of Jochi and Subade were returning from a campaign against the Merkits near the Caspian Sea, they unexpectedly encountered the army of Khwarazm Shah Muhammad II. In the battle, Jochi was wounded and nearly captured, but the Khitan prince serving under him saved him with a decisive counterattack. This episode only highlighted the importance of allied peoples in the Mongol army, but perhaps even more significant was the mass inclusion of northern Chinese in Genghis Khan's forces. It was they who played a key role in enabling the Mongol army to master the art of siege warfare. Mongol commanders tried to avoid heavy losses. Among their steppe horsemen, each nomadic archer was the result of years of upbringing and training, and in field battles such horsemen were virtually unbeatable. However, sieges of cities required enormous human resources, and using elite cavalry to storm the walls would have been an unjustifiable waste. Chinese troops filled this niche. They handled the transportation of siege engines, filled in moats, operated catapults and battering rams, and also performed the most ordinary tasks during fortress assaults. During the early conquest, tens or even hundreds of thousands of Chinese were mobilized into Mongol armies, creating a new class of siege warriors. Moreover, the Mongols adopted Chinese technologies as well, gaining access to powerful catapults, battering rams, and explosive charges developed by Chinese engineers. Later, the Mongols spread this knowledge far beyond the borders of China, using it to capture cities in Persia, Rus, and even in Europe. Although many Chinese were forced to participate in wars on the side of the Mongols, they were often used as cannon fodder, sent ahead to absorb enemy arrows. However, it cannot be denied that a significant number of Chinese voluntarily joined the side of Genghis Khan. This process intensified especially after 1215, when the Jin dynasty abandoned its capital Zhongdu. Many saw this as the loss of the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, which stripped the Yurkin dynasty of legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese population. In 1219, when Genghis Khan set out westward against Khwarezm Shah, there were more Chinese fighting on the Mongol side in China than there were Mongols themselves. Some Chinese troops were commanded by Mongol, Turkic, Khitan, or Uyghur officers, but a significant portion was led by Chinese generals who had defected to Genghis Khan's side. People like Shi Jin and Zhang Ruk. These commanders not only served the great Khan of their own free will, but also demonstrated exceptional loyalty. Shi Jin and his family remained important military leaders for the Mongols up until the reign of Kubilai, while Zhang Ru played a significant role in the conquest of China. He especially distinguished himself in the war against the Song dynasty, where he commanded Chinese troops fighting on the Mongol side. Thanks to him, the Mongols were able to adapt to waging war in the south, in various regions that were less suitable for cavalry. While Genghis Khan was fighting in the west, Muhali was left in China as a governor to keep the Jin forces under constant pressure. From 1217 to 1223, he conducted a brilliant, highly mobile campaign, striking at the weakened Jin Empire. The core of Muhali's army consisted of Mongol and Turkic cavalry as well as Tangut horsemen. However, in other provinces of China, he entrusted command to local allies who fought fierce battles against the Jin, expanding Mongol territories. As a result, most of the battles on the devastated Jin territory were not between the Mongols and the Jurchen, but between the Chinese themselves, who fought on both sides of the conflict. The situation was especially difficult in the eastern part of China, where an anti-war uprising broke out known as the Red Coats. Here, some field commanders were independent, while others supported the Mongols. A third group, loyal to the Song dynasty, but all hating the Jin, fought both against the Jin and among themselves. Some, like Li Quan, sided with the Mongols and fought against the Jin and Song for decades, for which they received high positions and rich rewards. His son, Li Tang, remained an influential regional warlord until 1262, when he rebelled against Kublai, probably bribed by Song emissaries. This rebellion signaled to the Mongols that they needed to strengthen their control over the Chinese military leaders who served them in China. Despite the tightening of Mongol control, the importance of the Chinese in the army continued to grow, especially during the war against the Song dynasty. China's southern, humid areas were less suited for cavalry. The Mongols organized a huge army and a river fleet that included many Chinese. The Mongol army in southern China still had Mongol cavalry as its core, but it was increasingly commanded by people from Central Asia. In the decisive campaigns against the Song dynasty, the last Song emperors fled to the island of Yishan in 1279. The United Mongol Chinese Army was commanded not by a Mongol, but by a northern Chinese, Zhang Hunfan, the son of Zhang Zhu. The Mongol conquest of China would have been impossible without Chinese soldiers, their siege equipment, and their experience in storming fortifications. The Mongols provided strategic leadership, but it was the Chinese troops who made the siege and conquest of cities a reality. The Mongols also used Chinese labor. Cities in Mongolia such as Karakorum and Chankay-Balgasun were built by the hands of Chinese workers. Chankay-Balgasun served as an industrial and agricultural center managed by the Chinese, providing supplies for the Mongol armies passing through western Mongolia during campaigns. But not only that, the Chinese were also involved as part of the Mongol armies in the west. As the Mongols advanced through the western steppes, Turkic tribes were gradually incorporated into their armies. During the lightning-fast conquest of the Kara-Khitan state by the commander Jebin Yon, the local garrisons, mostly without resistance, accepted Mongol rule. However, there is no substantial evidence that they participated in Genghis Khan's campaign against Khwarezm in the Khwarezmian state itself. A significant part of the army consisted of Kipchak Turks, and many of them, at the invitation of the Mongols, willingly left their posts to take up arms against their former masters. Genghis Khan often used forced mobilizations, pushing local populations ahead of his troops as he did in China. However, as the Mongols gained more experience in siege warfare, the need for such deserters decreased. Now the Mongols could simply use captured people in the most vulnerable positions. After the bloody campaign of Genghis Khan ended, the attitude toward the local population changed. The Mongols began to recruit them for garrison service, and regional commanders appointed by the Mongols rarely had a large number of nomads at their disposal. Therefore, when suppressing uprisings in conquered lands, it was not the steppe Mongols who took the first blow, but the local militias formed after the conquest. The Western campaign of Bati and Subede provided several vivid examples of the use of foreign troops. Chinese siege engineers actively used catapults during the sieges of Russian cities. The Tanguts took part in the capture of the Alan capital, Magaz, fighting side by side with the recently recruited Alans as part of the Mongol army. When a Mongol detachment was captured in Austria, the locals were surprised to find among the prisoners an Englishman who served as an interpreter and envoy for the Mongols. People were forcibly relocated in the opposite direction as well. Russian, Kipchak, and Alan warriors were sent east to serve in the Mongol army, often as bodyguards. It was believed that relocating such warriors would ensure their loyalty. A young Kipchak, for example, would hardly have mastered the Chinese language enough to conduct secret negotiations or escape, which meant he would remain completely dependent on the Khan. After the collapse of the unified Mongol Empire, the reliance on foreign troops only increased. In the Ilkhanate, Georgians and Armenians were widely used, especially as heavy cavalry, which played an important role in battles against the Mamluk Sultanate. Some believe that this was due to the superiority of the Caucasian cavalry, but it is more likely that the Mongols still sought to put foreign troops in the most dangerous positions in order to preserve their own forces. Kubilay's last campaigns especially vividly demonstrate the growing dependence on non-Mongol troops who performed tasks unsuitable for steppe cavalry, while the main Mongol forces guarded important regions, such as the borders with Central Asia. His naval expeditions were mainly manned by Chinese and other local troops for the invasion of Japan. The Koreans built the fleet and operated part of the ships, especially in the first expedition. The main forces consisted of northern Chinese, Jurchens, Khitans, and Mongols in the campaigns against Dai Viet, Champa, and Pagan. The Mongols fought side by side with former Song troops, and the army included soldiers from Yunnan and small states on the southwestern border of the late Song dynasty. During the campaigns in Vietnam and Java, Chinese ships and crews provided supplies. The Mongol army was never homogeneous. In addition to the troops mentioned, tens of thousands of people from different parts of Eurasia served in auxiliary roles. Local scouts pointed out routes, blacksmiths and craftsmen from Central Asia made and repaired weapons and equipment. Chinese doctors treated the wounded, although the main fighting power of the Mongols was provided by their elite cavalry. It was their flexibility and ability to use the knowledge and traditions of others that allowed them to go beyond the steppes and conquer most of Eurasia. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye, subtitles.